It seems like every famous startup founder has basically the same origin story. They had a crazy idea, everybody told them that it wouldn't work, they ignored the doubters, bet on themselves, and built something that changed everything. It's a great story, and it's everywhere. Books, podcasts, keynotes, commencement speeches. The message is always some version of the same thing. Believe in yourself, push through the resistance, and you'll make it. But here's what nobody mentions. For every founder who ignored the doubters and won, there are thousands who ignored the doubters and lost. They bet on themselves. They pushed through the resistance. They had the conviction. They had the work ethic. They had a vision. You just never heard about them. Not because their story doesn't matter, but because failure doesn't get a keynote slot. We've been handed a rule book written entirely by the people who made it through. And we've been treating that handbook as if it applies to everybody, when in reality, it only describes the survivors. So if you've ever made a decision based on what worked for somebody else, or assumed something was a safe bet because you'd seen it succeed before, stick around because this week we're talking about a bias that might be quietly distorting every plan that you make, and you'd never know it because the evidence against it never shows up. What's up, UX fam? Welcome to another edition of the Cognition catalog, where every week or so, we'll dig into a new cognitive bias and explore how that bias can impact how our team works together and what we can do to ensure we don't get caught up in the pitfalls. Because working with people is hard, and the more insights we have into the human condition make it just a little bit easier. To learn more about the survivorship bias, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. And shout out to this week's sponsor, Mobbin. If your team is tired of reinventing the wheel every time a new project kicks off, Mobbin gives you access to over 600,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows, all searchable with AI. It's the kind of tool that makes the whole team faster. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and see why more design teams are making it a company-wide staple in 2026. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then for the love of God, tell your mom and them. Now, only 1 in 20 small businesses ever crosses $1 million in revenue. 1 in 20. And that's just revenue. That's not profit. That's not sustainability. It's not I made it, quote unquote. It's just crossed $1 million at some point in time. Now consider the scale of what's actually happening out there. There are 36 million small businesses in the United States alone, and of the nearly 1 million that opened last year, over 200,000 closed within 12 months. That's roughly 600 businesses shutting down every single day. And after 10 years, 65% of them are gone. Now, that's the reality. That's the full picture. Now, think about how many of those stories you've heard. All the podcasts dedicated to entrepreneurship, all the books written by people who built something from nothing, all the LinkedIn posts about the grind paying off, the keynote speakers who dropped out, bet on themselves, changed everything with a first-to-market industry disruptor. Every single one of those stories comes from that 1 in 20. And the other 19 probably worked just as hard. I'm sure they had the conviction, they probably had a vision, I'm sure they got up early, they worked late. The people who failed did not get a book deal, they didn't get a podcast invite, and they didn't get the keynote slot. Their story ended quietly, and nobody documented it. So we consume all of this content about what it takes to build something, and then we walk away thinking that we understand the full picture. But we've only ever heard from the fraction that actually made it through. And somewhere along the way, we started treating their experience like it represents everybody else's, when in reality, it only represents a tiny slice of what actually happened. And that's the survivorship bias, and it doesn't just live in the startup world. When's the last time you read a case study about something that failed? Think about what goes into a portfolio case study. You finish a project, it goes well, you document the process, all the research, the decisions that you made, the iterations, the outcome. Then you write it up, you highlight all the best parts of the UI, you publish it, recruiters read it, other designers read it, and they think, oh, this person knows what they're doing. And that's the whole format. That's what a portfolio case study is. Nobody publishes a case study about the projects that got canceled halfway through. Nobody writes up the redesign that tested poorly. Nobody documents the features that they championed but never shipped. Or worse, shipped and flopped. But those projects exist. Every designer has them. but they don't make the portfolio. And because they don't make the portfolio, they just disappear. The work that survives is the work that succeeded, and that's the only work that anybody ever sees. So when you scroll through LinkedIn, or you read through somebody's portfolio, or you sit through a conference talk about a beautiful product launch, you've never seen a representative sample of anybody's career. You're only seeing the highlight reel. And then meanwhile, every designer looking at that work is sitting on a pile of projects that got canceled, redesigns that didn't test well, and features that shipped but quietly underperformed. But because nobody talks about that other work, it feels like an anomaly, like everybody else is out there doing career-defining work and you're the only one whose projects aren't measuring up. But that's not true. You're just only seeing the part that survived. So what is survivorship bias? Well, we tend to focus on the people, the products, or the ideas that made it through a selection process while completely overlooking the ones that didn't. This makes success look more common, it looks more attainable, and more predictable than it actually is. What we're really seeing is a highlight reel masquerading as the full picture. There's a reason we assume that hard work always pays off, that great products always find their market, and that bold decisions by bold leaders always pan out. It's because we're not drawing those conclusions from full data sets. We're drawing them from the fraction that survived. And that's the core of survivorship bias. When we evaluate outcomes, we instinctively look at the results that are visible. All those failures, all the shutter companies, the abandoned projects, and the quietly shelved ideas don't show up on our feed, so we treat their absence as if they never existed. The most famous demonstration of this comes from World War II. Statistician Abraham Wald was part of the statistical research group at Columbia University, and they were tasked with helping the military figure out how to better protect airplanes. So the team examined returning aircraft, and they noted heavy damage to the wings, the tail section, and the fuselage. So the instinct was to reinforce those areas. Now, Wald saw that flaw immediately. The planes that went down that weren't surviving had much better information to provide on the areas most important to reinforce. So Wald's insight was to consider all the things that started on the same path but didn't make it. Because the damage on the returning plane showed exactly where you could get hit and survive. The undamaged areas on the returning planes were the critical vulnerabilities, because planes hit there never came back. Now that logic feels kind of obvious in hindsight, but it almost wasn't caught. The psychological mechanism underneath this is pretty straightforward. We can only reason about what we can observe. Failures are invisible. Successes are loud. So our brains build mental models of how the world works based almost entirely on the cases that made it through. Nassim Taleb called the data obscured by survivorship bias silent evidence. We favor the visible, the tangible, and the concrete, but we discount what isn't in front of us. It isn't necessarily that we're lazy, it just shows how attention works. Now, the business world is particularly prone to this. Companies that fail early on, they just get ignored, while those rare successes are studied in textbooks and celebrated for decades. Studies of market performance often exclude companies that collapse, which can distort statistics and make success seem more probable than it actually is. The same dynamic plays out with the college dropout mythology. A handful of extremely famous dropouts become the story, but the millions of people who dropped out and didn't build billion-dollar companies are never mentioned. Not because their experience is irrelevant, but because it's just invisible. Nobody wrote their biographies, nobody invited them on podcasts. And this is the bias in action. The exception becomes the template. Now, for product teams, survivorship bias shows up quietly and often. And when it does, it tends to distort the decisions that matter the most. The most common version is using successful past projects as the default model for how to run new ones. For example, a team ships a product under aggressive timelines, it somehow works out, and suddenly aggressive timelines become the standard operating procedure. Nobody accounts for the dozens of other projects that burned out under the same conditions and were quietly canceled. And research practices and product teams can fall into this too. When discovery focuses mostly on active and engaged users, you're hearing from the people who stuck around. All those people who churn, or they bounced after onboarding, or never returned after a confusing first session, they aren't in your interview queue. But their experience is part of the product story. It's just the part you're not seeing. Survivorship bias can also shape team culture. High performers who thrive under certain conditions, they get promoted, they get profiled, they get asked to speak at all hands. Their approach to work gets established as how great work happens, but that framing completely ignores everybody who tried the same approach and burned out, disengaged, or just left. The model gets built on the outliers, not the distribution. And there's also a subtler version that shows up in how teams talk about process. Someone might say, we did this without documentation, it turned out fine. And maybe it did. But that one success doesn't mean that the approach is sound. It means it worked once for those people under those conditions. The times that it didn't work aren't part of the story because nobody's telling those stories. The fix isn't just cynicism and not believing anything. It's asking a different question, not just what worked, but what are we not seeing? Here are a few things that you and your team can try to hopefully avoid survivorship bias. First, ask who's missing from the room. Whenever you're drawing on past experiences to inform a decision, stop and ask what the failed versions of those examples look like. Before using a successful project as a blueprint, find out what happened to the projects that followed the same model but didn't work. The ones that didn't work are often more instructive than the ones that did, but they almost never get cited. Next, be skeptical of your active user data. If your research or feedback loops are built around your current engaged users, you're building on a filtered sample. The users who left after onboarding or churned after a few weeks or never got past the first screen, they took their experience with them. So make a deliberate effort to understand dropout points, not just what's working for the people who stuck around. Next, challenge the "we did this before and it worked" argument. Past success under similar conditions is useful context, but it's not proof. Before treating a previous win as a repeatable formula, pressure test it. Was it the approach or was it the timing? Was it team chemistry or was it just dumb luck? One success doesn't validate a method, it just means it worked once. So look for the counterexamples before committing to the pattern. Next, design retrospectives that capture what didn't finish. Abandoned projects carry lessons that completed ones rarely do. If your retro and postmortem culture only applies to work that shipped, you're missing some of your most important feedback. So build in a lightweight process for documenting why projects got canceled, why they got scoped down, or why they just got deprioritized, and actually reference that record when planning future work. And then lastly, name the bias explicitly in planning conversations. Survivorship bias thrives when it goes unacknowledged. When a team is anchoring on a success story, a competitor's launch, a past product decision, a growth tactic that worked once, name it out loud. Ask whether the evidence is representative or just the most visible example. Building that habit into how your team evaluates options, it can shift the conversation from "this worked before" to "here's what the full picture actually shows." Now remember that the highlight reel is not going away. Portfolios will keep showcasing the wins, podcasts will keep booking the founders who made it, case studies will keep documenting the launches that landed. The question was never whether success stories are worth learning from, because they are. The question is whether you're remembering to ask about the ones that didn't make the cut, because that's where the most honest picture of reality usually lives. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for the Cognition catalog for today. I hope it helped to shed a little bit of light on the survivorship bias and how we can avoid some of those pitfalls at work. But I'm curious, have you run into issues related to the survivorship bias before? How'd you get through it? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. To learn more about survivorship bias, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com. Click a little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. And if you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code YouTube to get 10% off your entire order. And if you have a favorite bias that you want to see in print, let me know. I'd be happy to take requests. And if your team is tired of reinventing the wheel every time a new project kicks off, Mobbin gives you access to over 600,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows, all searchable with AI. And it's the kind of tool that makes the whole team faster. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and see why more design teams are making it a company-wide staple in 2026. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.